Greetings, comrades. You are on the Ruslan Belov channel, and in today's episode, we will examine the situation in Ukraine as of December 4th, 2025. Over the past day, numerous critically important incidents have been recorded, so we are immediately proceeding with the analysis. So we move directly to the zone of active military operations, starting with the Zaporizhzhia segment of the contact line, where Russian armed formations continue to attack the population center of Huliaipol. It is precisely in this location that the most large-scale, fierce and bloody clashes are currently unfolding. The Kyiv command fully understands the strategic significance of the so-called Zaporizhzhia Wall, the key element of which is the city of Huliaipol. If this strategic line is lost, as we have repeatedly noted, one will be able to speak of the beginning of a countdown for Zaporizhzhia itself. It is no coincidence that the Russian side daily distributes video materials demonstrating exactly what defensive system of the Vostok grouping will have to be overcome. Let us once again pay attention to these materials. We need to clearly understand what goals and objectives are currently set before Russian military formations. Before them lies a grandiose, exceptionally powerful fortification system of the Ukrainian armed forces. This defense, apparently, will have to be broken through. It is not for nothing that we are being shown such footage. We observed similar footage during the clearing of the population center of Dobropilya. Today, additional materials were distributed. Let us carefully study them. In the presented recordings, we can also see Russian unmanned aerial vehicles performing flights over Highway R85, over the channel of the Haicha River, over the territory of the population center of Huliaipol. In addition, these materials capture the identification of strongpoints of the Ukrainian armed forces. We are talking about one of the most fortified defensive areas, and we clearly see what Russian military units will have to deal with. And the armed forces of Russia will break through this defensive system. Since at the moment there is no alternative, it is necessary to break through, consolidate, and subsequently advance in the western direction. But if this fortification line collapses, then, I repeat once more, we will be able to begin the countdown for Zaporizhzhia. This is perfectly understood in the Ukrainian capital. This is perfectly understood in the American capital, in the European capital. Naturally, this is also perfectly understood in the Russian capital. Well, we will continue observing how the situation will develop. Meanwhile, Russian military units are actively conducting an offensive in the direction of the population center of Huliaipol. Every day the Russian army distributes hundreds and possibly thousands of leaflets calling on Ukrainian servicemen to capitulate. The situation in this direction is extremely tense. The Russian side delivers all these agitation materials with surrender proposals, both using unmanned aerial vehicles and using artillery systems, including barrel artillery and multiple rocket launch systems. Simultaneously, the Russian side systematically delivers aviation bomb strikes on the central part of Huliaipol, on the western quarters, on key logistics routes. Essentially, assault operations are being conducted very intensively and powerfully. Such pressure, such onslaught from the Russian Federation has not been observed for a long time already. And all these video materials testify to only one thing, which we have also repeatedly discussed. The task is not simply to clear Huliaipol. The task is to accomplish this in the shortest possible time. How exactly the Russian Federation intends to overcome the defense of Huliaipol and the Zaporizhzhia defensive line is difficult to say definitively. But the process has already been launched, and it is definitely irreversible. Donetsk direction, Ivanivka, Pokrovsk, Mirnograd. Next, we move somewhat northward to the population centers of Havrilivka, Novopavlivka, and also Velikomykhailivka. Extremely important and significant information is coming from the territory of Ivanivka. Let me remind you that several days ago, Ukrainian information sources that are part of pro-Ukrainian cartographic resources, as well as representatives of the General Staff of Ukraine, made a series of statements according to which the Ukrainian army allegedly managed to completely clear the settlement of Ivanivka, located between Havrilivka and Novopavlivka. We discussed this situation, and this counteroffensive apparently, at the current moment, as it turned out, proved to be an informational counteroffensive, which occurred literally on the eve of Zelensky's trip to Macron before the start of the meeting between Witkoff and the Russian president. We then already came to the conclusion that probably the publication about the clearing of the settlement of Ivanivka represents something like an information attack, having nothing in common with the actual situation on the ground. Somewhat later, this information was also indirectly confirmed by various analysts and cartographic platforms. And then we also designated this territory as a grey zone until the final clarification of all circumstances. Nevertheless, already today, on December 4th, we are making a complete correction in the opposite direction. Today, video recordings appear showing how Ukrainian formations are only attempting to counterattack the settlement of Ivanivka along the northern perimeter. This indicates that Ivanivka is currently under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. Probably some separate sections and segments of the village are under the control of Ukrainian forces, but definitely not the entire settlement as a whole, as was stated by pro-Ukrainian resources. Next, we move in the direction of the population center of Pokrovsk, as well as the city of Mirnograd. From here today, a huge amount of critically important information is also arriving. Today, in the information space, absolutely everyone is discussing a map that was published by the Ukrainian General Staff. Today, everyone is openly mocking this map. Today, the General Staff of Ukraine publishes a map according to which not a single Russian serviceman has penetrated either the territory of Pokrovsk or the territory of Mirnograd. On the map distributed by the Ukrainian General Staff, both Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are shown under complete and reliable control of the armed forces of Ukraine. Probably this was done exclusively with the purpose of concealing the actual state of affairs on the ground. Therefore, they decided to use some archival map, possibly from June or July of 2025. But in any case, the attempt to hide reality led to the fact that a huge number of people dissatisfied with this situation appeared, including representatives of pro-Ukrainian sources. Meanwhile, the Russian army is actively conducting an offensive in all directions. More and more data these days is arriving from the territory of the population center of Hryshyn. Here, the Russian army is advancing quite intensively. Over the past 6 to 7 days, we have repeatedly received information from this sector, and according to all the latest data, published approximately from November 29th, the Russian army is actively advancing in the southeastern part of the population center of Hryshyn. And already today, information is arriving that Russian units managed to even penetrate into the central part of the settlement. How can one even talk about Mirnograd in general, if already to the west, northwest of Mirnograd, a buffer zone extending several kilometers has been created? We are talking about whether there are still chances for Ukrainian force units to break out of the encirclement. These chances no longer exist. The Russian army is actively advancing along the perimeter of Mirnograd. Today, footage is being distributed from the area of the population center of Rivne. In these recordings, we observe the movement of several Russian servicemen. Assault groups are moving, attempting to clear the settlement. Also, materials are arriving somewhat northward, from the territory of, most likely, fish farms. We observe here also Russian soldiers who are moving across the territory north of Mirnograd. That is, gradually, step by step, the noose is tightening around Mirnograd. Let me remind you that according to the latest information, up to 2,000 Ukrainian servicemen found themselves encircled on the territory of Mirnograd, or fell into complete encirclement, or into a cauldron. However, sources both pro-Russian and pro-Ukrainian report that currently on the territory of Mirnograd, the sanitary losses of Ukrainian force units have increased manifold. That is, in fact, the contingent of Ukrainian forces began to diminish in geometric progression. Zaporizhzhia, Toretsk, Lyman. Also today, information is arriving from the territory somewhat to the northeast, from the side of the population centers of Toretsk and Zaporizhzhia. Today, some pro-Russian analysts made important designations according to which the Russian army has already almost completely managed to clear Zaporizhzhia, as well as penetrate the southern outskirts of Toretsk. Based on all this data, one can come to the conclusion that already in the near future, the Ukrainian side will abandon this bridgehead and will be forced to retreat deeply toward Highway T0514 or toward the settlement of Druzhkivka. Next, we move to the Siversk sector of the front, more precisely Siversk-Lyman. As you can see, today from this direction, we again received the largest number of geolocations and video materials dedicated to strikes by FPV-type drones on positions, equipment, materiel, and personnel of the armed forces of Ukraine. This indicates that at the present time, the Toretsk-Lyman direction is one of the most priority and active. If we talk about adjustments, then today the most important and significant adjustments are coming from the territory of the settlement of Pokrovsk. Today, pro-Russian analysts, predominantly neutral cartographers, note the advancement of Russian units. At the present moment, already at least 30 and possibly 40% of the settlement of Pokrovsk is under the control of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. The Ukrainian side controls strongpoints on the heights to the north, as well as the western part of the settlement. The advancement along Pokrovsk is part of the plan for the complete encirclement of the population center of Siversk. The Ukrainian side is trying to break out of the encirclement via country roads, across fields along forest belts. Nevertheless, this territory is under complete fire control, and at the present time it is extremely difficult to exit from Siversk to the west. On the Lyman sector of the front, military operations continue along the perimeter of the city of Lyman. The Russian army at the present moment, according to both pro-neutral and pro-Ukrainian sources, is actively storming two settlements. These are Dibrova and Oziern. At the present time, active intensive military clashes are unfolding in the area of the two villages. The Russian army is striving in a broad front to reach the Siversky Donetsk River, as well as the settlements of Starodubivka, Piskunivka, Kriva Luka. Probably the Russian army will attempt to ford the river precisely in this sector in order to reach the rear of the Ukrainian forces, grouping located on the Siversk-Ry-Oleksandrivka line. That is, here the Russian army definitely has specific goals and plans. Kupiansk and Kharkiv direction. On the Kupiansk sector, without changes. Although it would be worth noting that, according to the president of the Russian Federation, according to his statement made several days ago, the Russian army was supposed today, or possibly tomorrow, to announce the complete clearing of the settlement of Kupiansk-Vuzlovyi. In the Kharkiv direction, the Russian army continues assault operations in the direction of the settlement of Vovchansk. Today, from this sector, several video recordings were published about military operations for the period from November 24th to the current day. In these materials, we can observe the remains, or what is left of the settlement of Vovcha. We see that the Russian army is actively erasing this settlement to zero, since in this direction, on the territory of this settlement, a large group of the armed forces of Ukraine is concentrated, which they are trying to squeeze out into the fields, as well as further south, toward the settlements of Bili Kolodiaz, as well as toward the settlement of Stary Saltiv. And that is all, dear comrades. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to the channel, give your likes, and all the best to you.